I always knew I wasn't their favorite, but I never expected it to be this brutal. Every birthday, every accomplishment, every tiny victory was met with an eye roll or a comparison to my perfect older brother. "Why can't you be more like him?" my parents would ask, as if their words could shrink me into nothing. I felt invisible, a constant disappointment in a house where favoritism wasn't subtle, it was a rule. But I had a secret they didn't know: I wasn't going to stay a failure forever. I was planning my own escape, my own victory, and one day, they'd see the daughter they'd written off. The turning point didn't happen all at once. It was a series of small, cutting remarks that built up over years until one comment finally shattered me. I had just come home from college, excited about a small project I'd been working on, a seed of an idea for an agricultural technology startup that could revolutionize crop efficiency. I could barely contain my excitement as I explained it to my parents over dinner, thinking maybe, just maybe, they'd be proud. Instead, my father scoffed. "Another one of your useless schemes? When will you grow up and get a real job?" My mother barely looked up from her phone, murmuring, "You always think you're special." "It's embarrassing." I froze. I wanted to scream, to throw something across the room, but I stayed quiet. I learned long ago that arguing with them was pointless, their minds were already made up. I was a disappointment, a failed daughter, and no amount of proof would change that. That night, I went to my room and stared at the walls, the same walls I had grown up in, feeling like a stranger in my own home. I realized something crucial: if I wanted to succeed, I couldn't rely on them. Their approval wasn't just useless, it was toxic. Every ounce of energy I spent trying to prove myself to them had been wasted. From now on, I would build my life for myself, not for their validation. I began working obsessively on my AgTech idea. Days blurred into nights. I taught myself coding, read every book I could find on agricultural technology, and watched countless tutorials about hydroponics, soil sensors, and IoT farming devices. Every obstacle felt like another nail in the coffin of their expectations. "You're wasting your time," my father had said once, and each step forward became proof I could prove him wrong, eventually. College friends noticed the change. I wasn't the anxious, hesitant Alexis who would shrink into the background. I was sharp, ambitious, and unapologetic. I networked relentlessly, attending conferences, pitching ideas, and absorbing every piece of feedback I could get. My parents, of course, remained oblivious. They never called to ask how I was doing or expressed any curiosity about my life beyond the facade of mediocrity they had assigned to me. One evening, after a particularly draining family dinner where my achievements were ignored in favor of my brother's latest vacation or bonus, I came home and slammed the door. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed out a plan. Every feature, every prototype, every financial projection went into a detailed document that I treated as my roadmap out of the shadow of my family's disdain. This wasn't just about success, it was about survival, emotional, financial, and mental. I started small, building a prototype sensor system that could monitor soil moisture and nutrient levels in real time. I invested my own savings, skipped social outings, and even moved into a tiny studio apartment to cut costs. Sleep became optional, food often secondary, but every setback taught me resilience. I was finally learning that the world didn't judge me based on family favoritism. The real world rewarded effort, intelligence, and persistence, all the things my parents never seemed to value in me. At times, loneliness hit hard. My parents never called, never asked how I was doing, and certainly never supported my endeavor. My brother was busy with his own life, riding the tide of their praise and indulgence. I often wondered if they even realized I existed outside their criticisms. But that thought quickly transformed into motivation. I was no longer their failed daughter, I was a force they had yet to comprehend. Networking became crucial. I reached out to mentors, professors, and industry leaders, often being ignored or dismissed because I was young and inexperienced. But gradually, a few believed in me. They helped me refine my prototypes, gave advice on scaling, and introduced me to investors. Each small victory, each email that ended in encouragement, reminded me that I didn't need my parents' approval. I had my own support network, one built on merit, not favoritism. By the end of the first year, my prototype worked better than I expected. I managed to get a small investment from a local angel investor who was impressed with my dedication and vision. That was the first taste of validation I had ever experienced, real validation, earned through sleepless nights, determination, and creativity. The kind that my parents could never take away or diminish because it existed entirely outside their world. The more progress I made, the more I realized how completely my parents had underestimated me. Every new prototype, every investor meeting, every small milestone felt like a personal victory over the years of dismissive comments and rolling eyes. But the real test came one evening when I received a call from my mother. "Alexis, can you maybe help your brother with some money? He's struggling with a business venture," she said, her voice casual as if she were discussing the weather. I froze. It was exactly what I had feared. After years of ignoring my existence, my parents suddenly wanted me to bail someone else out financially. I felt my blood boil, but this time, I didn't shrink. I calmly replied, "I'm not in a position to do that right now." There was silence, and then my mother's voice turned sharp. "Don't be selfish. You have a good job, you can spare it." That moment crystallized everything for me. I wasn't just their failure, I was a resource in their eyes. My accomplishments didn't matter, my worth was only measured by what I could provide for their favorite child. I realized that if I ever wanted freedom, I had to take control entirely, emotionally, professionally, and financially. From that night on, I stopped seeking any approval from them. I channeled all my energy into my startup, working late into the night, perfecting algorithms, redesigning sensors, and preparing pitches. Every rejection, every investor that said no, became fuel. I wasn't just building a company, I was building my future, one that my parents couldn't touch or dictate. Launching a startup alone is terrifying. I didn't have a safety net, and I certainly didn't have parental support. But what I had was determination and a deep understanding that this was my chance to prove my worth, to myself and, eventually, to those who doubted me. I began pitching to every small investor I could find. Many laughed when I said I was building an AgTech company as a 20-something woman with no family backing. They told me I'd fail. But slowly, one meeting at a time, I gained traction. A local entrepreneur offered me mentorship, another investor provided seed funding. These people valued me for my ideas, my effort, and my vision, not for my last name or family connections. Every morning, I woke up early, often before the sun rose, checking soil data, improving prototypes, and managing a growing list of contacts. My apartment became a lab, my kitchen turned into a workspace, and my couch doubled as a bed for nights when deadlines loomed. I was exhausted, but I was also alive in a way I had never felt while living under the shadow of my parents' criticism. The first major breakthrough came when one of my sensors significantly improved crop yield in a small pilot farm. I documented the results meticulously, creating detailed reports that would later impress investors. It was proof not just of the technology, but of my ability to deliver results, something my parents had never acknowledged. But the emotional toll of isolation was heavy. I missed family gatherings, birthdays, even casual dinners. But whenever I felt lonely, I reminded myself, this was the price of freedom. And the freedom I craved wasn't just physical, it was emotional. I was learning that success without validation from the wrong people was far more rewarding than any temporary praise from them could ever be. By the second year, the startup began hiring. I assembled a small, dedicated team of engineers and data analysts who shared my vision. We worked tirelessly to perfect the technology, running simulations, and testing crops in different environments. Each success, each improvement, was a small victory that belonged entirely to me and my team, not to my parents, not to my brother, not to anyone who had ever doubted me. Financially, things were still tight. I lived frugally, reinvesting every dollar back into the company. I skipped vacations, luxuries, and even basic comforts. But with every setback, I grew stronger. Investors who had initially dismissed me started to take notice as news of our breakthroughs spread. Articles were written about our innovative approach to sustainable agriculture. Suddenly, the world outside my home was recognizing the potential that my parents had ignored for years. My team and I worked day and night to prepare for the first major funding round. The pitch deck was flawless, the data was solid, and the product was ready to scale. I remember sitting in my tiny office, staring at the ceiling late one night, thinking about the years of ridicule, the endless comparisons, and the feeling of being dismissed at every turn. I smiled to myself, realizing that all those moments had prepared me for this very instant. I was finally in control. When the day of the pitch arrived, I stood in front of a room full of investors, hands steady, voice confident. I walked them through our technology, our projections, and our vision for the future of farming. Questions came fast and sharp, but I had answers ready, detailed, data-backed, and uncompromising. By the end of the session, multiple investors were eager to contribute. I had done it. I had proven, with tangible evidence, that I was capable of far more than my parents had ever imagined. The next few months were a blur of negotiations, product scaling, and team expansion. Our small startup grew into a company with real influence, partnerships, and contracts. My parents, of course, had no idea what I had achieved. Any mention of Alexis's startup was met with indifference or, worse, a dismissive comment. "She'll probably fail like everything else," my mother would say in passing. Little did they know, failure wasn't in my vocabulary anymore. As our company grew, so did my confidence. I hired more engineers, expanded our pilot farms, and even started developing proprietary software that integrated sensor data into predictive analytics for farmers. Every milestone was a quiet victory, one that my parents would never acknowledge. But that didn't matter anymore. I was building a life defined by my own achievements, not their approval. The deeper I immersed myself in the business, the more I realized something profound. I was no longer a failed daughter. I was a creator, a leader, a woman who had turned every insult, every slight, into fuel for her success. My parents had spent decades trying to minimize me, and yet here I was, building something that could change lives, including my own. Emails from journalists started coming in. Local newspapers wanted interviews. Tech blogs highlighted our innovations. It was thrilling, not just because of the recognition, but because I knew the praise was earned honestly, without favoritism, nepotism, or manipulation. The people who mattered most were those who had believed in me, my team, my mentors, and myself. By the third year, our company was profitable. Contracts with larger farms brought in consistent revenue, and the technology had proven itself reliable and innovative. My little startup, born from quiet rebellion and determination, was no longer small. Investors who once doubted me now called for meetings, eager to get a piece of the action. I smiled at the irony. Every failure comment my parents had thrown at me had been a step toward my unshakable drive, a force they could never control. The sale of my company was unexpected even to me. A larger AgTech firm reached out with an offer, $8.5 million. I sat in my office, staring at the contract, feeling a mix of disbelief, triumph, and vindication. This was the moment that would define the next chapter of my life. I had turned years of neglect, ridicule, and emotional abuse into tangible success. For a moment, I thought about calling my parents. Just to see how they'd react. But the thought quickly faded. They didn't care when I had nothing, so why would they deserve a front-row seat to my victory? I celebrated quietly with my team, acknowledging the countless late nights, the failures, the relentless work ethic that had made this possible. The news inevitably leaked. Mutual acquaintances and distant family started reaching out with congratulations. The very same people who had watched me struggle in silence now treated me like a celebrity. Invitations to speak at conferences, interviews with major media outlets, and features in industry publications began pouring in. It was validation of a different kind, one that came from merit, not familial expectation. Then, it happened. The first message from my parents arrived. My mother, in a tone that felt rehearsed, said, "We heard about your company. Congratulations, Alexis. We're proud of you." My father added a brief, "Well done, I guess." It was polite, but it lacked authenticity. I could almost feel the sudden calculations behind their words. They weren't proud, they were assessing how much they could gain from my success. True to form, my parents' interest intensified immediately. Calls became more frequent. Questions about my financial status turned into requests. Could you help your brother with a down payment for his house? Or maybe you could contribute to your sister's college fund? It was exhausting to witness how quickly they tried to insert themselves into my achievements. I realized something important. Success had not changed them, only revealed their entitlement. They hadn't loved or respected me when I had nothing. Now that I had wealth and influence, suddenly, I was useful. It was infuriating and strangely satisfying. Infuriating because they were entitled, and satisfying because I now had the power to choose the terms of any engagement, or to refuse entirely. I decided to keep my responses measured. I would not reward entitlement with generosity. I politely declined requests, citing business commitments or personal goals. Each refusal was a small victory, a way to reclaim the power I had long been denied. For years, they had tried to control me through emotional manipulation. Now, I controlled the narrative. Months passed, and the excitement of the sale settled into a powerful sense of independence. I could finally live life on my terms, make decisions without guilt, and pursue opportunities one had dreamed of. I traveled, invested wisely, and built a home where my achievements weren't minimized, a home filled with respect and peace. Despite my success, my parents' attempts to insert themselves continued. My mother would call casually, trying to slip in questions about investments or family obligations. We were thinking, maybe you could buy a new car for your brother? He's struggling. I laughed silently. The audacity of their entitlement was staggering. They had called me a failure for decades, yet now they acted as though my success existed to serve them. Every time I declined, I felt a mix of relief and empowerment. I wasn't just saying no, I was reclaiming the life I had built with sweat, tears, and sleepless nights. I realized the truth: success isn't about proving your worth to everyone else, it's about proving it to yourself and living free from toxic expectations. The first family gathering after the sale was surreal. Invitations arrived via email, almost as if nothing had changed in our relationships. My parents included my brother and his wife, expecting me to attend, smile, and perhaps contribute in some way. I decided to go, partly to witness their reactions firsthand. Walking into the room, I felt an odd mix of nostalgia and irritation. The same familiar faces, the same subtle judgments, and the same unspoken hierarchy greeted me. My parents' eyes widened slightly when they saw me, not with genuine joy, but with an assessment: this was the successful daughter. During dinner, my father couldn't resist a jab. So, Alexis, what are you doing with all that money? Any plans to help the family? My mother smiled sweetly, leaning in as though she were offering advice. You know, it's the right thing to do to help your siblings. I sipped my drink slowly, letting their words hang in the air. Then, calmly and deliberately, I said, I appreciate your concern, but my accomplishments aren't a resource for anyone else's comfort. I worked years without support, and now I choose how to use what I've earned. That includes my family, selectively, if at all. The room fell silent. I watched their faces twist between shock, disbelief, and the faint glimmer of regret. They had expected compliance, not confrontation. For the first time, I held all the power in that room. I wasn't just their failed daughter anymore, I was Alexis, the woman who had proven her worth on her own terms. My brother tried to interject, but I stopped him politely, explaining that success didn't obligate me to subsidize entitlement. My words weren't cruel, they were truth. And truth, finally, was the currency I could wield freely. From that day on, boundaries were clear. My parents continued to test limits, but I never wavered. Invitations, requests, subtle guilt trips, none of it worked. I had built a life where I determined my own worth. I didn't need validation from people who had spent years undermining me. The emotional freedom that came with that realization was unparalleled. Looking back, it's surreal how far I've come. I went from being labeled a failure to creating a company that sold for $8.5 million, all without the support or encouragement of the people who were supposed to believe in me most. It wasn't just financial success that mattered, it was the emotional liberation. I learned that family doesn't automatically define your value. Toxicity, entitlement, and favoritism are not obligations we must endure. Success, when built with resilience, vision, and self-belief, gives you the power to choose who you allow into your life. I chose wisely. Today, I invest in people who inspire me, build communities that respect each other's worth, and enjoy the quiet victories that come from genuine effort. My parents? They remain in their world of entitlement, but it no longer affects me. I've rewritten the narrative of my life, not for their approval, but for my own peace and fulfillment. If there's one lesson I want to share, it's this: no one gets to define your value. You do. And sometimes, proving it requires building your dreams alone, but the rewards, both financial and emotional, are worth every sleepless night, every doubt, and every moment of being underestimated. I grew up as the failed daughter, the one my parents always compared to my older brother and cousin. No matter what I achieved, it was never enough. I tried to excel in school, but my awards were ignored, my dreams dismissed, and my ideas ridiculed. Every family gathering felt like a trial where I could never measure up. I remember one Thanksgiving when my dad loudly proclaimed I would never amount to anything. Back then, I wanted to disappear. But little did they know that so-called failure would one day build an AgTech company worth millions.